Lorenzo Vitiello ran a disciplined operation. That was the first thing anyone who came close to his world understood, and it was usually the last thing that surprised them. Discipline was not a style for him. It was the structure that kept everything else alive. The payroll ran on time. The tribute came in clean. The lawyers were on retainer and never had to work too hard, because Enzo's men were trained not to leave problems behind them. Every moving part of the Brooklyn syndicate had a place and a function, and Enzo had built it that way over 15 years by removing, without sentiment, anything that didn't fit. He was 38 years old and looked it in the way that men who have carried weight for a long time look their age. There was nothing soft about him. His face was angular and composed, his eyes a flat, pale gray that people tended to find difficult to hold. He dressed plainly, dark trousers, a good shirt, nothing that announced itself. He didn't want to be looked at. He wanted to be understood, and in his world, those were not the same thing. On the morning of the last Thursday in October, he sat at a folding table in the back of a fish wholesaler on Atlantic Avenue, while two of his men held a man named Caruso against the wall by his collar. Caruso was 40, with the face of someone who had been making small bad decisions his entire life, and had finally made a large one. He had skimmed $11,000 from a cash collection route over 6 weeks and had apparently believed that the shortfalls would be absorbed quietly into the general accounting. It was a misunderstanding about how Enzo's organization worked. Enzo didn't speak for a long time. He reviewed a ledger on the table. He turned a page. He turned another. Caruso was breathing hard, the back of his shirt damp. "You took 11,400, Enzo said. He didn't look up. "The 400 is interesting. Most men round to the nearest thousand. You took 400 on top. That means you needed the 400. Caruso said nothing. "That tells me you have a specific problem," Enzo said. "Not greed. A specific problem. What is it?" Caruso said his daughter had a medical situation and the insurance hadn't come through. He said it the way a man says something true that he knows won't help him. Enzo closed the ledger. He looked at Caruso directly for the first time. "If you had come to me with that, I would have given you the money and you would have owed me a favor. Instead, you took it, which means I can't trust you on a route, which means you're useless to me now." He paused. "You understand what that means?" Caruso said he understood. "Your daughter gets the money," Enzo said. "Full amount, covered. You're off the routes permanently, and you owe me 18 months of clean work in the warehouse at reduced rate. If I hear your name in connection with anything else, we don't have this conversation again." He stood and left. One of his men stayed behind to give Caruso the specifics. That was how Enzo handled most things. Efficiently, with consequences that were proportional, because disproportionate consequences created instability, and instability was the one thing he had spent 15 years preventing. His car was a black 4-door sedan, American-made, nothing distinctive. His driver, a quiet man named Tesoro, had been with him for 9 years. They moved through Brooklyn without fanfare. Enzo sat in the back with a second ledger across his knee, going through it with a pen while Tesoro navigated the morning traffic toward Red Hook. The organization controlled a modest but reliable portfolio. There were legitimate fronts, 2 laundromats, a construction supply company, a private parking management service that handled 3 lots in Sunset Park. There were less legitimate operations. Protection arrangements with several commercial districts, a small but steady loan sharking arm managed by a man named DeLuca, and an interest in a cargo handling operation at the port. It was not a dynasty. Enzo had never wanted a dynasty. He had wanted something that worked, that lasted, and that didn't attract the kind of attention that ended organizations. The person who kept it all from becoming a dynasty was also the person who had helped Enzo build it in the first place. That was Aldo Vitiello, his mother's brother, 61 years old, with a face like old concrete and a mind that Enzo had trusted completely for 15 years. Aldo ran the operational layer. He managed the capos, handled disputes between district crews, and acted as the institutional memory of the organization, the man who remembered what had worked before, what had failed, who could be pushed and who couldn't. When Enzo was still learning the business in his early 20s, Aldo had been the one sitting across from him at kitchen tables, explaining how things actually functioned. The formal structure gave Enzo the authority. Aldo gave him the knowledge to use it. Their relationship was not warm. It had never been warm. Aldo was not a warm man. and Enzo had long since stopped being the kind of person who needed warmth from anyone. But it was functional and it was consistent, and in Enzo's world, those were the qualities that mattered. Enzo arrived at the Red Hook warehouse at 9:15. He met with his port contact, a union representative named Fiorini, regarding a dispute over the distribution of supplemental cargo, handling contracts. The meeting took 40 minutes and resolved in Enzo's favor, as these meetings generally did. He then met with DeLuca about the loan portfolio, reviewed 2 problem accounts, and authorized a specific collection approach for each that fell within acceptable parameters. By noon he was back in the car. He had a wedding that afternoon. The arrangement had been in motion for 6 weeks. The bride's father, a man named Costello, ran a mid-sized electrical contracting firm that had been doing legitimate municipal work for 20 years. Costello had borrowed money from DeLuca's arm 3 years ago to cover a payroll shortfall during a project dispute and had never fully dug himself out. The debt had been restructured twice. Now it was in the range that made it structural, the kind of obligation that became part of a relationship rather than a transaction. Enzo had not wanted to get married. He had been married once before, briefly, in his late 20s, to a woman who had understood what he was and had eventually decided she couldn't live with that understanding. It had ended without drama. He didn't blame her. He had no strong feelings about it in either direction. This marriage was different in nature. Costello's daughter, Elora, was 22, worked at a graphic design studio in Park Slope, and by all available information had nothing to do with her father's financial arrangements. She had been informed of the situation 4 weeks before the wedding. From what Enzo's men reported, she had not responded well, which was a normal response, and had eventually agreed, which was also predictable given the circumstances. The ceremony was held at a venue in Carroll Gardens that the syndicate had a partial interest in. It was not elaborate. There were about 80 guests, most of them associated with the organization in some capacity. Costello's side was thin. His wife was deceased. There were 2 aunts, a brother-in-law, a handful of colleagues. Elora arrived in a car with her father. She was slight, with dark hair and a careful, composed expression that Enzo recognized as someone maintaining control of themselves through an effort of will. She walked through the ceremony without looking at him much. Enzo did not look at her much either. The officiant moved quickly. The exchange of formalities took 12 minutes. Enzo signed the documents and the thing was done. At the reception, Enzo sat with his capos at the main table and did not join his wife at the secondary table where she had been placed with her family. This was deliberate. The men around him needed to see that the marriage was exactly what it was. An arrangement, a tool, nothing that would complicate his judgment or soften his decisions. He made a point, when the subject came up, of referring to her with a mild contempt that was designed to be overheard. "She seems frightened of her own shadow," he said to a capo named Prior, loud enough for 2 other men to hear. "Makes me wonder how Costello ever ran a business." It landed as intended. The men laughed briefly and moved on. Enzo watched Elora across the room, not with cruelty. Cruelty required caring enough to aim it, but with a flat assessment. She was sitting very still. She had barely touched her food. Her father was talking at her about something she wasn't listening to. She looked the way people looked when they had decided to simply endure a period of time until it ended. By 9 in the evening, Enzo had reviewed 3 operational matters with different members of his organization, eaten a minimal dinner, and consumed 2 glasses of wine over the course of 4 hours. He was ready to leave. He found Aldo near the bar, speaking with Prior. "The girl goes to the estate," Enzo said quietly. "West Wing. Marco handles the arrangements." Aldo nodded. His expression was neutral, but there was something in the way he held his glass that registered with Enzo as attentive. More attentive than the situation required. He filed that away and said nothing. The estate was a converted property in Bay Ridge, a large, older house that had been substantially modified over the years. High fencing, a good security system, 2 men on rotation at the gate. It was not a showpiece. It was a fortified residence that happened to have several bedrooms, and a large study on the ground floor, where Enzo did most of his work in the evenings. He arrived home ahead of Elora and changed out of his wedding clothes. By 10:30 he was at his desk in the study with the extortion ledgers from the South Brooklyn accounts spread across the surface, a lamp on, the rest of the house quiet. The security rotation had reported in. The gate was closed. Two of his men were in the kitchen at the end of the hall. Elara was brought in by one of Marco's men and taken directly to the guest wing on the second floor. Enzo didn't go upstairs. He heard the footsteps on the staircase and then the sound of a door closing, and then nothing. He worked until nearly midnight. The ledgers were straightforward. A few accounts running thin, one address that was generating friction with a business owner who had recently changed accountants and appeared to be reconsidering his arrangement. He made notes. He would have DeLuca address the friction case directly in the morning. He was about to close the last ledger when he heard a sound. It came from upstairs, faint, filtered through the floor and ceiling between the study and the guest room. He didn't immediately understand what it was. It was too soft to be crying, too structured for distress. It took him several seconds to identify it as singing. He put down his pen. The sound was quiet. Whoever was singing was not singing to be heard. It had the quality of something private, a person doing something to manage a feeling rather than to express it. Enzo sat very still and listened, and the recognition came to him in a way that had no logic to it, arriving before he had time to think it through. He knew the song, not in the vague way that a person might recognize something remembered from childhood, a melody that could belong to several things. He knew it exactly. He knew the specific fall of the intervals, the particular rhythm of it, the way certain syllables bent and others held. He had heard it once in his life, in a closet with a broken latch in a house in Bensonhurst, sung in a whisper by his mother, while she held him still against the wall and told him with her eyes not to make a sound. He had been 8 years old. The men who came into the house that night had made noise, not loud noise, controlled noise, the sound of people moving with purpose through a building they didn't need to be careful in. His mother had heard them on the stairs. She had moved him to the closet in under a minute, and she had sung to him while she held the door shut from outside, and he had listened to the song and to the sounds beyond the song until both of them stopped. He had never heard that song again. It was not a recorded song. It was not a lullaby from a book or a film or a catalog of traditional Sicilian folk music. His mother had sung it to him occasionally at bedtime when he was very young, and he had understood later, when he was old enough to ask, that she had learned it from her own mother, and it was not something that existed outside their family. Enzo stood up from the desk. He moved to the hallway and stood at the base of the stairs. The sound was slightly clearer from there. It was her. Elara, sitting somewhere in the guest room in the dark, singing a song that she should not have known. He went up the stairs. His hand was on the wall as he climbed. He stood in front of the guest room door for a moment before he opened it. He pushed the door open hard. The sound stopped. Elara was sitting on the floor at the far side of the bed, her knees drawn up, still in part of her wedding dress, staring at him with wide eyes. He had his gun in his hand. He wasn't certain when he had picked it up. She looked at the gun and then at his face, and whatever she saw there made her press herself back against the wall. "Where did you hear that?" His voice came out low and uneven. "Where did you hear that song?" She didn't answer. She was looking at the gun. He lowered it. He was breathing harder than the stairs warranted. He forced himself to stand still and lower his voice further. "The song you were singing. I need to know where you heard it." "I don't." Her voice was barely audible. "I don't understand what you're asking." "The lullaby," he said. "Where did you learn it?" She stared at him. She was genuinely confused or genuinely terrified, and at this moment he couldn't tell which, and it didn't matter. He left the room, went back downstairs, sat in the study chair, and did not move for a long time. In the morning he called Marco. Marco Bedini was 44, had been with Enzo for 11 years, and was the only person in the organization that Enzo trusted with anything he actually needed done carefully. He was not a physically impressive man, medium height, thinning hair, the unremarkable appearance of a mid-level accountant. He was also meticulous, loyal without being emotional about it, and had a background in investigative work from a period in his 20s that he rarely discussed and that Enzo had found useful on a number of occasions. "I need a full background on my wife," Enzo said. "Not what Costello told us. Everything. Childhood placement records if there are any, who she was in contact with, schools, addresses. Everything from birth to now." Marco didn't ask why. He said he'd have something preliminary within 48 hours. In the meantime, Enzo ran the operation as normal. He met with Pryor about the South Brooklyn accounts. He reviewed DeLuca's collection notes on the friction case. He took a call from the port contact about a scheduling issue and resolved it in 15 minutes. He did not go upstairs to speak with Alara. He had one of the household staff bring her meals and confirm that she was secure and not in any distress beyond what the situation itself created. He was in the middle of a call with his attorney on Tuesday afternoon when Aldo came through the front gate without advance notice. This was unusual. Aldo did not arrive unannounced. He had not arrived unannounced in the 15 years of their working relationship. Enzo ended the call, put the phone down, and waited. Aldo came into the study and sat in the chair across the desk. He looked the same as always, heavy through the shoulders, deliberate in his movements, the face of a man who had learned long ago not to show what he was thinking. "You look distracted," Aldo said. "I'm working," Enzo said. "The dock situation. I heard there was a scheduling problem. It's handled." Aldo was quiet for a moment. He looked around the study in a way that was not quite casual. "The Costello girl. She's settling in? She's in the guest wing. It's not a concern. Pryor said you were asking about the records from the wedding. The seating, the guest list. Pryor talks too much. He was answering a question I asked him," Aldo said. "I wanted to know how the reception went. You left early. People noticed. People are always noticing things that aren't their business," Enzo said. "The operation is running fine. The marriage is a formality. There's nothing to discuss." Aldo looked at him for a moment with that flat, unreadable attention that Enzo had grown up interpreting. Then he nodded and stood. He said he'd be at the Red Hook office on Thursday if Enzo needed to go through the quarterly numbers. He left without any additional conversation. Enzo sat at his desk after the car left the driveway and thought about what had just happened. Aldo checking in was not unusual. Aldo arriving unannounced to check in was unusual. The distinction was small, but it was there, and Enzo had built his life on paying attention to small distinctions. He went upstairs that afternoon. Alara was at the window seat, reading something on her phone. She looked up when he came in. She was wearing plain clothes now. She had apparently been given access to her bags, and without the formality of the day before she looked younger, though her expression was careful and watchful. He sat in the chair near the door. He didn't have anything prepared to say. He looked at her for a moment and then said, "I'm not going to explain what happened the other night. I need to ask you a specific question and I need you to answer it directly." She waited. "The song you were singing. Who taught it to you?" She looked uncertain. "A woman. At the group home. I was in state care from 9 to 14. There was a woman there. She wasn't official staff. She was more like a volunteer. She came several times a week. Her name was Lucia." Enzo said nothing. "She taught me the song when I was 10 or 11. She said it was for sleeping. When things were difficult at night, she would come to the door and sing it." Alara paused. She was old. 70s, probably. Sicilian. She had an accent. "Did she tell you where the song came from?" "She said it was a family song. She said it was old." Alara looked at him carefully. "Why does it matter?" He didn't answer that. He asked for the name of the group home and the year she had been there. She gave him both. He asked if Lucia had ever mentioned her family, and Alara said she hadn't, except once. She had mentioned, in passing, that her family was mostly gone and that she had no one left in the country. Enzo stood. He said, "You're not in danger in this house. I need you to stay here for the moment. I'll explain more when I can." She said, "You humiliated me in front of 80 people 2 days ago." He stopped in the doorway. "I'm not saying it to make you feel bad," she said. "I'm saying it because I need you to understand what you're asking when you ask me to simply cooperate." He turned and looked at her. Her voice was even. She wasn't angry the way someone who is performing anger sounds angry. She was simply stating a fact and waiting to see what he did with it. "You're right," he said. He said it without qualification and left the room. Marco's preliminary report arrived the following morning in an envelope delivered by hand. Enzo read it twice before he called Marco in. The file confirmed what Alara had told him: state placement from age 9, the group home in Woodhaven, the years matching exactly. There were records of a female volunteer associated with the home during the relevant period, listed under the name Lucia Ferrara. The description Marco had sourced from 2 former staff members who still lived in the area. Older woman, 70s, Sicilian-born, white-haired, walked with a slight limp on the right side. Marco put a second page on the desk. Enzo read it. His mother's family name, her maiden name, which he had known, and beside it a second name, her sister Anna, born 4 years after his mother in a village outside Palermo. The record indicated that Anna had immigrated in her 30s. The last known address in the United States was from 1992. A subsequent record, which Marco had sourced from a state database, listed her as deceased, killed in a fire at a residential address in Bensonhurst in October of 1994. The same month his mother had been killed. The same address. How reliable is that death record? Enzo asked. It was filed 3 days after the date of the fire. Marco said. It was filed by a city clerk and it cites a coroner's report. I pulled the coroner's record. It's thin, 2 lines. No physical description. No dental records. No photograph. In 1994, those records were often incomplete, especially for secondary victims in a structure fire. He paused. It's possible the record was filed for a person who wasn't dead. Someone with enough access to file a death record for a living person? Enzo said. Not much access. Marco said. Not in 1994. A form, a clerk, the right paperwork. Especially if the coroner's report was already thin. Enzo stood and walked to the window. The courtyard below was empty. The morning was overcast. The night of October 14, 1994. He had replayed that night more times than he had ever told anyone. He had been 8 years old, and his mother had put him in the closet and told him to stay quiet, and he had stayed quiet. He had heard 2 men's voices. Not shouting, ordinary voices. The way people sounded when they were doing a job. He had heard his mother say something once, a single sentence, and then nothing. He had stayed in the closet for 4 hours before anyone found him. He had never been told who ordered it. His grandfather had been the boss then, and his grandfather had told him when he was old enough that it had been a rival crew, that the matter had been settled, that it was finished. He had accepted that because he was 10 years old when he was told, and because it came from a man he had no reason to doubt. His grandfather had been dead for 8 years, the man who had taken over the organizational structure after his grandfather stepped back, the man who had guided Enzo through his rise and had positioned himself as the necessary institutional layer beneath Enzo's authority, was Aldo. Aldo, who was not his blood, who was his mother's brother, in law by way of a marriage in the 70s to a Vitiello cousin, not a direct family member, but family, adjacent, close enough to be trusted, close enough to be in the house in Bensonhurst on ordinary evenings, close enough to know the layout, close enough to know when his mother would be alone. Enzo turned from the window. The physical description of Lucia Ferrara. Age appropriate for Anna if she were alive. Accent consistent. Visible limp. The coroner's secondary report mentions a fall injury to the right leg of one of the recovered individuals. Marco said carefully. But the records are vague enough that you can't confirm which individual. Can you put Lucia Ferrara's timeline alongside Anna's known history? Any overlap in documented locations? Any consistent pattern? I need another day on that. I can pull the volunteer records from the group home, cross-reference the documented home addresses. He paused. There's one more thing. The group home in Wood Haven. It was funded partially through a charitable foundation for the period Alara was resident there. The foundation is defunct, but I traced the original filing. One of the listed board members is a name you'll recognize. He put a 3rd page on the desk. Enzo looked at it. The name was there clearly. Aldo Vitiello, listed as a non-executive board member of the foundation from 1996 to 2003. He closed the file. He sat back in his chair and thought about what that meant. Aldo on the board of the foundation that funded the home where Alara had been placed. Alara, who had been taught a song by a woman who matched every description of his mother's sister. His mother's sister, whose death record was filed 3 days after a fire in which she was supposedly killed alongside his mother. There were 3 possibilities. The first was coincidence, which Enzo dismissed not from paranoia but from the accumulated weight of the details. Too many points of contact. The second was that Aldo had placed Alara specifically, that he had found Anna, and used her location to create a link, though the purpose of that was opaque. The third was the one that settled in Enzo's chest with a cold and specific weight. Aldo had arranged the original hit. Aldo had known Anna survived, and had known her location for 30 years, and the marriage. The arrangement itself, the convenient resolution of Costello's debt through a wedding rather than through any number of simpler mechanisms, had been structured by Aldo to bring Alara into this house. And if Aldo had arranged this marriage, and if Aldo had known about Anna and about the song for 30 years, then the question wasn't why Aldo had done it. The question was what Aldo intended to do next. He looked at Marco. Nobody hears about this. Not Pryor, not DeLuca, not anyone in the crew. You do the rest of the research yourself. You don't delegate any part of it, and you call me directly on the secondary line. Marco nodded. How long to build a complete picture? 4 days. Maybe 5. You have 3. After Marco left, Enzo went back upstairs. He knocked on the door this time. Elara was at the window again. He came in and sat down and looked at her for a moment. Lucia, he said, did she ever tell you to be careful about a specific family? Or a specific name? She looked at him steadily. She told me not to trust men with the Vitilo family crest. He let that sit in the air between them for a moment. How did she describe them? She said they had their hands in the wrong things and that they would use people who got too close without those people ever knowing they'd been used. She paused. She said it specifically about the crest, a particular signet ring. She described it. Enzo wore no ring. He had stopped wearing the family crest when he was 26, after a situation in which a photograph had been used in an unwelcome context. He had never gone back to it. But Aldo wore the ring. Had worn it since the 80s, every day, without exception. Did she tell you why she warned you? She said she had made a mistake once trusting people she shouldn't have trusted, and she didn't want me to make the same mistake. He nodded slowly. He stood. He looked at Elara and said, I'm going to explain this to you in detail soon. What I need you to do in the meantime is stay in this building and not contact anyone about your location or your situation. She said, my father knows I'm here. Your father is fine. I need you to be careful about communications beyond your father. Specifically, I need you not to use anything that goes through the house network. Use your personal phone, no calls, only messages to your father and no one else. She watched him. You're afraid of something. I'm being careful about something, he said. There's a difference. He went back to the study, sat at the desk, and began to think through the operational picture with the kind of methodical attention he brought to everything. If his assessment was correct, and the available evidence was pointing in one direction with increasing force, then Aldo had spent 30 years in the organization with a secret that could end him. The secret had apparently been stable and contained for 30 years. Something had changed. The marriage had been Aldo's arrangement. That meant Aldo had moved Elara into the estate, deliberately. The question that mattered was whether Aldo was trying to cover something or create something. If he was covering, if he had brought Elara close in order to monitor or control the only person who carried a direct link to Anna, and therefore to what had happened in 1994, then Enzo still had time. If he was creating, if the arrangement was meant to accelerate something, to put a particular piece in a particular place, then the timeline was compressed and Enzo was already behind. He spent the rest of that day watching Aldo's movement patterns through the secondary communication channel he maintained with a man named Ferrero, who ran logistics for the port operation and who had no particular loyalty to Aldo or to anyone else. He told Ferrero nothing, asked for nothing unusual, just a passive report on dock schedules and personnel movement over the next several days. By the end of that evening, he had 2 data points that troubled him. Aldo had met with Pryor for 90 minutes at a location off-site from any of their usual meeting points. And DeLuca had changed his collection schedule for the week, which he had done without flagging it to Enzo or to any of the normal reporting chain. These were not dramatic events. They were the kind of thing that, in isolation, could have an entirely reasonable explanation. But Enzo had built his understanding of his organization on the premise that unexplained deviations from pattern were always significant, even when the significance wasn't immediately clear. He filed both items and waited. Marco called on the morning of the 3rd day. He said he had the complete picture and that Enzo needed to see it in person. They met at the laundromat on 4th Avenue. Enzo arrived first and stood at the back near the dry-side machines. Marco came in 5 minutes later, sat down across from him at a folding table, and opened the file. The file was thorough. Marco had built a timeline that crossed, referenced state records, the group home's administrative documents, the foundation filing, property records in Queens and Brooklyn, and 3 sources he described only as reliable contacts in city administration. Anna Ferrara, his mother's sister, had been documented at the Woodhaven address from 1997 to 2011, living under the name Lucia Ferrara, which was close enough to her real name to be the choice of someone who had decided to hide in plain sight. rather than construct a complete false identity. The alias was thin, but it had worked because nobody had looked for her. Her supposed death record had never been contested, because nobody with standing to contest it knew she was alive. The group home record showed her present as a regular volunteer from 1997 to 2009. Alara's placement had been from 2003 to 2009, a complete overlap with the latter part of Anna's documented volunteer period. Aldo's connection to the foundation was confirmed through the filing Marco had already identified. But the file contained something additional, an internal foundation record from 2005. A board meeting minute that listed a motion to add a residential support fund for a specific group home address. The motion was listed as passed, and the person who had introduced it was Aldo Vidiello. He knew she was there, Enzo said. He knew she was there and he funded the institution, Marco said, which means he had visibility into who was resident and what was happening. Enzo turned the next page. The fourth section of the file was an analysis of the 1994 fire. Marco had found a fire department report that had never been prominently indexed. It was in a city archive, not digitized until 2019 as part of a records modernization project. The report documented the fire as starting in the structure's utility room, which was inconsistent with the official cause listed in the city's primary record, which attributed it to a kitchen appliance malfunction. The responding crew's notes, written by a lieutenant named Garza who had since retired, included an annotation. Inconsistent origin. Possible accelerant referred to arson unit. The arson unit follow-up document in the archive showed the referral had been closed without investigation 3 days after it was filed. In 1994, the Brooklyn Arson Unit's administrative oversight ran through a city official named Brennan, who was later investigated in 2001 for unrelated corruption and was found to have taken payments from at least 3 organized crime figures during his tenure. Aldo Vidiello's name did not appear in the 2001 investigation, but 2 of the 3 figures named had direct operational relationships with him that Enzo was able to verify through his own knowledge of the organization's history. The chain was not proven. It could not be proven in any courtroom sense. But it was a chain, a sequence of connections that moved from the fire, to the suppressed arson referral, to the official who suppressed it, to the organized crime figures who paid that official to Aldo. Is there anything that directly names him? Enzo asked. No, Marco said. There's circumstantial construction. There's a clear pattern. There's no single document that says his name. What about the foundation's funding sources? Where did the money actually come from? That's the last section. Enzo turned the final pages. The foundation's funding chain ran through 2 holding entities before reaching a source. Marco had traced both entities. The primary source was a commercial real estate management company incorporated in New Jersey. The beneficial owner of that company, listed in the state filing, was Aldo Vidiello. So Aldo had not merely been aware of where Anna was living. He had been paying for it. He had structured the funding in a way that was meant to be opaque. And it was opaque. It had taken Marco 3 days of close work to pierce it. But it was there. Aldo had been funding the institution that housed his mother's sister for years after a fire in which that sister was supposed to have died. There was only one reason to do that. Aldo knew Anna was alive. Aldo had allowed her to survive, or had specifically arranged her survival, and had maintained control over her situation by funding her environment. He hadn't killed her because killing her risked exposure. Allowing her to live, carefully in a controlled environment, was cleaner. And then, 30 years later, the old woman who knew the song had taught it to a young girl who had grown up and been married into the Vidiello estate. Whether Aldo had known about the song was unclear. Whether he understood the specific link between that song and Enzo's memory was impossible to know. But Aldo had structured the marriage. Aldo had arranged for Alara to come into this house. And Aldo had been present at the organization for 30 years, careful and patient and always exactly where he needed to be. Enzo closed the file. He sat for a moment. Destroy the copies, he said. Keep one in the location you use for personal documents. Tell no one? Marco nodded. I need 2 more things from you? Enzo said. First, I need to understand Aldo's current operational position. Specifically, which capos are closer to him than to me. I have a sense of it, but I want your assessment. Prior. Without question. Prior has been running his crew for 8 years and Aldo made that happen. DeLuca is probably in the same category. Aldo vouched for him when he came up. Carbone I'm not sure about. Fazio and Greco I believe are genuinely yours. That's roughly what I thought. Second, what is Aldo's current physical security arrangement? Marco looked at him carefully. His personal driver changes every 6 months. Current driver is a man named Russo. He keeps 2 men on the gate at his house in Whitaker Heights. When he moves, he uses Russo and 1 additional man in a second vehicle. He's been consistent with that for years. Does he vary his routes? Less than you do. Enzo nodded. He told Marco to go back to normal work and to keep the secondary line available. He did not tell Marco what he was going to do, but Marco had been with him long enough to understand that when Enzo asked about someone's security arrangement, the conversation was entering a different phase. He drove back to the estate himself without Tesoro. He came in through the back entrance and went directly to the study. He stood at the desk and thought for a long time without sitting down. The operational situation was as follows. He had evidence, not courtroom evidence, but actionable evidence, that his underboss had ordered the murder of his mother 30 years ago, had suppressed the investigation of that murder, had maintained knowledge of his mother's surviving sister for 30 years, and had arranged, for reasons that were not fully clear, a marriage that placed that sister's surrogate daughter inside Enzo's home. He had an organization in which 2 of his senior capos were probably closer to Aldo than to him, which meant any internal process, any attempt to move against Aldo through organizational channels, would be immediately compromised. He had a wife in the guest room upstairs who was a civilian and who had been unknowingly inserted into a situation she could not fully understand. He had 3 options. The first was to move against Aldo directly and quickly, before Aldo understood what Enzo knew. The risk there was operational. If he moved too quickly, he might miss something. And if the outcome was incomplete, the parts of the organization loyal to Aldo would respond. The second was to build a fuller picture, take more time, position himself more carefully. The risk there was that Aldo would become aware that something was wrong and would move first. The third option was to use institutional channels, law enforcement, federal investigators, which would end the organization entirely, but would also provide a structural outcome that removed the problem permanently. He sat down. The third option was the one he kept returning to. Not out of any particular alignment with law enforcement. He had spent 15 years actively opposing it, but out of a cold assessment of reality. The organization was structurally compromised. 2 of his capos were unreliable. His underboss had been operating for 30 years with an agenda Enzo had not known about. The foundation that he had believed he was building had been built, in part, on a lie managed by a man who had every reason to maintain that lie for the rest of his life. There was also the question of what happened after. If Enzo moved against Aldo and won, he would be running a smaller, more fractured organization, with several of his senior people gone or in opposition. The federal attention that had been managed carefully for 15 years would intensify the moment there was open violence between syndicate members. The structural outcome of winning that internal war was an organization so weakened that it became more vulnerable than it had been before. He thought about Alara upstairs. He thought about the fact that she had been placed in this house not by any choice of her own, had been humiliated at her own wedding by a man who had treated her as a tool, and was now sitting in a locked building while the details of someone else's 30-year crime were being assembled around her. He thought about the woman in the closet who had held a door shut from the outside and sung a quiet song to a child who needed to stay still. He made a decision. He called Tesoro and told him to arrange a meeting at the laundromat in 2 hours. He called Marco on the secondary line and told him to be there. He then went upstairs and knocked on Alara's door. She was sitting at the desk this time, writing something by hand. She looked up. "I'm going to tell you what's happening," he said. He came in and sat in the chair. "Not all of it tonight, but enough so that you understand what I need you to do." She put the pen down and waited. He told her about his mother. He told her about the closet and the song and the night in 1994. He told her the part she needed to understand. That the song she had learned from Lucia was the same song. That Lucia was almost certainly his mother's sister. That he was building evidence that the man responsible for his mother's death had been operating within his own organization for 30 years. He did not tell her his conclusions about Aldo yet, or about the marriage arrangement. He told her enough. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Lucia," she said. "She's alive." "I believe so." She's not at the Woodhaven address anymore, Marco checked. She moved sometime in the last few years. I'm still trying to locate her. She was kind to me, Alara said. She was the only person in that building who was. I used to think she was lonely. She would come in the evenings and she would sit with whoever was having a difficult night and she would just be there. She stopped. She told me to remember the song. Did she say why? She said it was important. That there were people in the world who would recognize it and that if I ever met one of them, I should trust them. He looked at her. He thought about that for a moment. The old woman in the group home teaching a young girl a specific song, telling her to trust the person who recognized it. Whether it had been deliberate or instinctive, it had done exactly what she apparently intended. I need you to trust me now, he said. I know I haven't earned that. I know what I did at the reception was something I can't undo. But I need you to stay here, to stay off the communications I mentioned, and to be prepared to move quickly if I tell you to. She looked at him steadily. What are you going to do? I'm going to end this, he said. He went downstairs and made the calls. The meeting at the laundromat that evening included Marco, Tesaro, and a man named Vital who had done freelance legal work for the organization for several years and who had, more recently, established a careful working relationship with a federal organized crime task force that Enzo had been aware of, but had not previously chosen to engage. Vital was the kind of lawyer who had made his way through two worlds for so long that he was no longer entirely comfortable in either. He was precise, careful, and he understood the architecture of the kind of deal that Enzo was thinking about. Full cooperation? Enzo said. Documented. I give them the operational structure, the financial architecture, the key personnel, the connections to elected officials and port administration, the specific activities of the last 10 years. Everything that's on paper and everything that isn't. Vital looked at him without expression. In exchange for immunity for Tesaro and for Marco, they had no involvement in the things I'll be describing. Structured outcome for myself. I'm not walking away clean, I understand that. But I want the terms negotiated and I want the scope understood before I agree to anything. This will dismantle the organization entirely, Vital said. That's the point, Enzo said. Aldo Vidiello? Specifically and completely, Enzo said. The 1994 matter is included. Marco has a documented file that will support it. I want that charge in the agreement. Vital was quiet for a moment. He said he would need 48 hours to make a preliminary contact and establish the framework. You have 24, Enzo said. After that, Aldo is going to know something is wrong and the window closes. Vital left. Marco looked at Enzo across the folding table. You're giving up the organization, Marco said. The organization was already compromised, Enzo said. I was running it on information I didn't have. And the capos who go down with it. They made their choices, Enzo said. I'm making mine. Marco nodded slowly. What do I do in the meantime? You go to work normally? You answer Aldo if he calls. You tell him nothing has changed. If he asks about the background check on Alara, you say it turned up nothing significant. Clean background, no complications? And if he already knows? Then he already knows and we're moving faster than I'd like. Enzo stood. Go home. Stay on the secondary line. The next 24 hours were the most controlled piece of waiting Enzo had done in his professional life. He ran the day normally. He took calls from Prior and handled a routine matter about a commercial account. He returned a message from DeLuca about the friction case that had already been resolved. He ate dinner at the desk and worked until 10. At 9:15 in the evening of the following day, Vital called the secondary line. The federal task force had responded positively. There was interest. The framework for a preliminary meeting was established. Vital had been careful with what he shared at the initial contact. Enough to establish credibility, not enough to create exposure before terms were negotiated. The meeting was set for the day after next, at a federal building in Lower Manhattan, with a specific agent named Hartley who ran the task force's organized crime unit. Enzo slept 4 hours and was at his desk by 5 in the morning. Aldo called at 8:30. He asked, conversationally about the Alara background check. Marco says it's clean, Enzo said. Nothing useful. That's what I'd expect, Aldo said. The girl is just a girl. Costello's kid? Right. I was thinking we should sit down this week about the quarterly review. There are some numbers in the port operation I want to walk through with you. Thursday, Enzo said. The Red Hook office. Thursday works. He ended the call and sat for a moment. Aldo had no specific knowledge yet. The Thursday meeting would be a problem if things moved slowly, but the federal meeting was Wednesday. He would have a preliminary agreement in place before Thursday arrived. He went upstairs and knocked on Ilara's door. She was awake. She had made coffee somehow. One of the household staff had apparently provided the supplies, and she offered him a cup, which was an oddly ordinary gesture in the circumstances. He took it. "How are you doing?" he asked. "I'm managing," she said. "I've been thinking about Lucia, about where she might be now. Once this is resolved, I'll find her," he said. "I promise you that." She looked at him over the rim of her cup. "Do you know what you're going to do yet?" "Yes." "Is it going to be violent?" He considered the question. "It could be." "I'm trying to make sure it isn't," she said. "I'm not going to pretend I understand everything about what you do. But whatever you decide, I think you should make it so that you can actually live with it afterward." He looked at her for a moment. He thought about the woman in the closet. He thought about 15 years of building something on a foundation that had been rotten before the first stone was laid. He thought about what living with something actually meant. Not the managed distance he had maintained from every consequence of his choices for the last 15 years, but the actual weight of it. "I'm working on that," he said. The federal meeting on Wednesday went for 4 hours. Enzo came in with Vitail. Agent Hartley was 45, with a careful manner and the slightly contained energy of someone who had been waiting for a particular thing to happen for a long time and was now being cautious about believing it had. He had a deputy and a lawyer from the U.S. Attorney's Office. They laid the framework over the first hour and spent the next 3 reviewing the preliminary material Enzo had authorized Vitail to share. The financial architecture of the organization was, in itself, sufficient to generate multiple federal charges. The port connections implicated 2 union officials and 1 city contract administrator. The charitable foundation connection and its link to the 1994 fire established a predicate for a homicide charge against Aldo. Not a certainty, given the age and indirectness of the evidence, but strong enough to support an arrest and prosecution with Marco's file as a foundation. The terms were negotiated carefully. Tesoro received full immunity, documented and signed. Marco received the same. Enzo's own agreement was structured around formal cooperation. He would not be immune but would receive a cooperation credit that substantially reduced his sentencing exposure. He understood this meant a period of incarceration. He had known that from the beginning. He did not negotiate against it. He signed the preliminary agreement that afternoon. The full cooperation process would take months and involve multiple sessions. The federal action against the organization would begin in parallel, with the first arrests coordinated for a point when enough of the documented evidence was in federal hands to make the arrests sustainable. Aldo would be arrested on a Thursday morning. Hartley told him this in a matter-of-fact tone. The specific Thursday was 3 weeks out. Enzo should conduct himself normally in the interim. He drove back to Bay Ridge in the early evening. He parked in the driveway and sat in the car for a few minutes before going in. The street was quiet. A neighbor's light was on. An ordinary street, an ordinary evening. He went inside and knocked on the guest room door. "It's done?" he said when Ilara opened it. She looked at him carefully. "Which kind of done?" "The legal kind," he said. "The only kind that actually ends things." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "And Lucia?" "Anna? I'm going to find her. I'm going to make sure she knows it's over." He paused. "She protected you. She protected me 30 years ago. She deserves to know it wasn't for nothing." Ilara leaned against the doorframe. She looked tired, but the watchful tension in her face had shifted slightly. Not gone, but less acute. "What happens now?" she said. "The organization shuts down over the next several months as the federal process moves forward. My role in that process is formal cooperation." He said it plainly, without softening. "I'm going to face charges?" "I've agreed to that. I'm not asking you to stay while that happens. You're free to go. Back to your father's house. Back to your life. The debt is cleared as part of this. Costello has no further obligation." She looked at him for a long moment. "Is that what you want? For me to go?" "I don't think what I want is the relevant question," he said. "You came into this house because you had no real choice. You should leave because you do." She nodded slowly. "I'll think about it." He went downstairs and sat at his desk. The ledgers were still there. He pushed them to the side. There was no point in the ledgers now. The accounts, the roots, the friction cases, and the collection schedules. All of it was in the process of becoming evidence. And within a few months it would belong to the federal government rather than to him. He sat in the quiet of the study for a long time. He thought about the closet. He thought about the way a child's understanding of the world is shaped by the specific trauma it absorbs. The lessons that get built into the bone before the brain is old enough to question them. He had learned in that closet that the world was dangerous, that safety was an illusion, and that the only protection against it was control. He had spent 30 years building control. He had built an empire of it, layer by layer, crew by crew, ledger by ledger, until the control was so thorough and so complete that nothing could touch it. And beneath all of it, for 30 years, Aldo had been there, patient and present and completely unmoved. He thought about what the old woman in the group home had told a small, frightened girl, that there were people in the world who would recognize the song, and that if she met one of them, she should trust them. He had not been particularly trustworthy. He had spent the first 2 days of his marriage treating Elara with a deliberate contempt that he had deployed as a performance of power, and that he now understood, without sentimentality, had been something smaller than that. A man doing the thing he knew how to do, because doing it was easier than admitting he didn't know what else to do. He would have to account for that, eventually, in whatever way made sense when the legal process was behind him and the organization was gone, and he was whoever he was going to be after all of it. 3 weeks passed in a controlled routine. He met with Aldo on the Thursday as planned and sat through the quarterly review with a steadiness that cost him something. He wasn't sure what. He had 2 further meetings with Hartley's team and provided additional documentation, financial records that Marco had helped him organize, a timeline of the port operations management structure, 2 recorded conversations that had been legally authorized, and that provided significant corroboration for the organizational hierarchy. He continued to run the surface of the operation normally. He took the calls, reviewed the ledgers, managed the personnel decisions. It was the most efficient and focused month of his professional life, because none of it was for the organization anymore. It was information gathering, and information gathering was something he was very good at. Elara did not leave. She moved into a different room on her own initiative. "The room with the better light," she said, and she began doing her design work remotely from the estate, which required an accommodation from her employer that she apparently secured without difficulty. She cooked occasionally, which surprised the household staff. She and Enzo ate dinner in the same room twice in the first week, and, by the second week, at the same table. They did not discuss the future directly. They discussed smaller things. What she was working on, a particular architectural detail of the estate that she found interesting, a book she was reading. He was not accustomed to conversation that didn't have an operational purpose, and he was not good at it in the beginning. He said too little and then occasionally, unexpectedly too much. She was patient with it in a way that was not performative. She was patient the way a person is patient when they have decided to be honest about what they want and are willing to wait for the other person to catch up. On the morning of the 3rd Thursday at 6:50, Enzo was standing at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee when he saw 3 federal vehicles come through the gate. He had known they were coming. He had been given a courtesy window of 48 hours and had spent that time in the final debrief sessions with Hartley and the U.S. Attorney's team. The arrests were executing simultaneously across several locations: Aldo's house in Diker Heights, Pryor's residence in Bay Ridge, DeLuca's apartment in Borough Park, the Red Hook warehouse and the port offices. It was coordinated and it was comprehensive. Hartley had called it thorough. The evidence package was, according to the federal lawyers, the most organized and complete submission they had received from an organizational insider in the task force's 15-year history. Enzo had been complimented for the quality of his documentation. He had not found this particularly gratifying. He set the coffee down, went to the hallway, and called upstairs. Elara came down in a few minutes. She looked at the vehicles through the front window. "It's time," he said. She looked at him. She didn't ask questions. She went back upstairs and came down a few minutes later with a small bag. He had arranged for Tesoro to take her to her father's house. Tesoro was waiting in the driveway in his own car. The federal vehicles were parked at the gate and 2 agents were approaching the front door. He had 2 minutes, maybe 3. The estate is going to be an evidence site for a while, he said. After that, the legal process will determine what happens to the assets. You don't need to worry about any of that. She looked at him. Are you scared? He thought about that honestly. No, he said. I think I was scared for 30 years. This is just what comes after. She put her hand on his arm for a moment. Just for a moment, brief and deliberate. Then she walked to the front door and out through the driveway toward Tessero's car. He watched the car pull out as the agents reached the steps. He opened the front door before they knocked. The processing took the remainder of the morning. He was cooperative throughout. He said nothing that was not already documented. He answered every question directly and completely. He signed what was placed in front of him. By the afternoon, he was in a holding facility in Lower Manhattan, in a clean room with a table and a chair and a window that looked onto a concrete wall. He sat at the table. He thought about Aldo, who would be in a room like this, or soon would be. He thought about what Aldo's face had looked like across 30 years of meetings and decisions, and about whether there had been moments when Aldo had looked at him and seen the 8-year-old in the closet and felt something. He didn't know. He found that he didn't need to know. The question was not what Aldo felt. The question was what Enzo did with the time he had, and that question had finally become answerable. He thought about Anna, his mother's sister, somewhere in the city or outside it, old now, living quietly under a name that was almost but not quite her own. Marco would find her. Marco had the resources and the motivation, and he was free now, the immunity signed and filed. It might take months, it would happen. He thought about the song. He had not thought about it in exactly this way before, as a deliberate act. A choice his mother made in the final minutes of her life, to give something to her child that might matter someday. He did not know if she had calculated it. He did not think she had. He thought she had just done the thing that felt right, which was to hold him still and keep him quiet and give him something steady to listen to in the dark. He had listened. 30 years later, someone else had listened, and the thing she gave him had moved through time and found its way back. The legal process ran for 8 months. The federal case against the organization resulted in 19 arrests and 14 convictions, including Prior, DeLuca, and several second-tier crew members. The port operation was dismantled. The construction supply company was seized and its assets liquidated. The laundromats and parking lots were placed under federal administration pending resolution of the asset forfeiture proceedings. Aldo Vitiello was charged on 3 counts: racketeering, conspiracy, and a homicide count tied to the 1994 fire. The homicide count was the most difficult, as Hartley had predicted. The evidence was circumstantial and old, and the defense made the predictable arguments about document gaps and chain of custody. It went to trial in the spring. Marco testified for 14 hours over 2 days. He was methodical and precise, and the jury found him credible. Aldo was convicted on all 3 counts in late May. Enzo heard about the verdict through Vital, who called on an authorized communication. He sat with it for a few minutes and then went to the window. The cooperation credit had reduced his sentencing exposure substantially. He received a sentence of 36 months with the possibility of release at 24, which was the outcome Vital had modeled from the beginning. He served 22 months and was released in August of the following year. He came out into a Tuesday morning in Lower Manhattan, into the specific unremarkable quality of an ordinary Tuesday. Traffic and pedestrians and a food cart on the corner with a line of office workers. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment with a single bag, and the address of a hotel Vital had arranged, and he breathed the air, which smelled like exhaust and something frying, and the particular character of a city that had continued without him. Marco had found Anna 6 weeks before Enzo's release. She was living in a small town in southern New Jersey, in a rented house near the shore, under the name she had been using for 25 years. She was 78. She was in reasonable health. She had been told, carefully through an intermediary, that the situation had changed and that she was no longer in danger. Enzo went to see her on his 3rd day out. She was smaller than he expected. He had constructed some version of her from the description Marco had given him and from his own sense of what his mother had looked like. They had apparently been similar in build and coloring. But the woman who opened the door of the small house was simply old, with white hair and a slight limp and careful eyes. She knew who he was immediately. She stood in the doorway for a moment, and then stepped back to let him in. They sat at a kitchen table with coffee. She asked him what had happened, and he told her, briefly and directly, as much as she needed to know. She listened. When he finished, she was quiet for a while. "I wanted to come back," she said, "many times. I wanted to tell you. But I didn't know who I could trust inside the family, and I didn't know if knowing would help you or hurt you." "It helped," he said. Eventually, she looked at him. She was very afraid. That night. "Your mother," she knew something was wrong before they came in. She had felt it for weeks. She paused. "She talked about you constantly. She would have been proud of you?" He sat with that for a moment. "She also would have told you to let it go sooner than you did," Anna said, with a dry precision that reminded him, briefly and painfully, of something he couldn't quite name. He almost smiled. "Probably." He stayed for 2 hours. He met Alara for dinner that evening at a small restaurant in the West Village. She had moved back to her apartment in Park Slope, and had resumed her work and her life, which had been briefly disarranged by the events of the previous year, and which had, by all appearances, recovered. She looked well. She looked like herself, composed and watchful, and in quiet moments not quite at rest. "How was it?" she asked, meaning Anna. "Good," he said. "Difficult." "Good." "Did you tell her about Lucia teaching me the song?" "I told her." She wasn't surprised. She said she'd always hoped the song would find its way somewhere useful. He paused. "She asked about you." Alara looked at him. She said that the girl who remembered the song must be someone worth knowing. He said this plainly, without ornamentation, because he had spent enough of his life doing things with an eye toward effect, and this particular thing deserved to be said straight. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You're staying in the city, for now. I have some things to figure out." "Me too," she said. They ate dinner. The restaurant was quiet, and the food was good, and outside the window the street went on doing what streets do. At some point during the meal he realized that he had not thought about the organization in the last several hours, had not reflexively inventoried the room for threat or opportunity, had not been managing his expression against whatever was on his face. He was simply sitting at a table with a person he had treated badly, and was trying to treat differently, in a city that had done what it always did and continued on, and he was, for the first time in a very long time, simply present in it. The organization was gone. The men who had built it and run it, and, in some cases, betrayed it were in federal custody, or would be shortly. The financial infrastructure had been dismantled. The accounts were frozen and the fronts were under administration. 15 years of construction had been reduced to case files and evidence boxes in a federal building downtown. That was the outcome. He did not mourn it. He had built it on a lie he hadn't known was there, and its dismantling was the most honest thing he had done in connection with it. He paid the check, and they walked out into the evening. The city was doing its usual thing. Noise and movement and the specific density of a place where a great many people are trying to do a great many things at the same time. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment. He had a hotel for the week, and an appointment with a resettlement counselor that Vital had arranged for the following Monday. He had no operational obligations, no routes, no ledgers, no capos, no tribute. He had a phone with a small number of contacts and a bank account with a modest balance in 2 months of clear-headed, thinking about what kind of person he wanted to be when the account was settled. He didn't know exactly what that looked like yet. He knew it was going to take work, and he knew he was capable of work. He knew that there were consequences behind him that he owed people. Not in the way that organized crime counted debts, but in the actual human sense of having done harm to people who didn't deserve it. Some of those consequences could be addressed. Some couldn't. He knew that Alara was walking beside him, and that she was doing so because she had made a choice to, and that the choice was not obligatory or historical or transactional but simply her own. He knew that Anna was in a small house in New Jersey, and that she was not hiding anymore. And that when she sat in her kitchen in the morning, she did not have to count the vehicles that passed outside, or keep a bag ready by the door. These were the facts as they stood. He thought about the closet one more time. The dark and the silence in the song, and the way a child receives certain things and carries them without knowing why, and the way those things travel through time and people and circumstances until they arrive, finally, where they were always going. He let it go. Not the memory. He didn't think the memory would ever entirely leave him, and he had made a kind of peace with that. But the weight of it. the thing he had been carrying since he was 8 years old. The proof that the world was only danger and only control. The need to build every wall at maximum height, and keep everyone at maximum distance and never allow anything to reach him that might move him off his center. He put it down, finally, on a Tuesday evening on a sidewalk in Manhattan, without ceremony, and kept walking.